Yeah, while it's coming up, so I'm the adaptation specialist for the Michigan DNR, and so I've been working on adaptation here since well, full time since 2012, which is it's been a lot of fun. Before that, I was working on endangered species, and then habitat restoration for endangered species. So I'm a ecologist by training and trade. So learning about networks and systems has been something that I've been learning about, and a lot of what I'll be talking about today is pulling from a book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, and also pulling from a class that I took at Michigan State University on systems dynamics and how to model systems in a collaborative framework. So without further ado, I'll jump into it. Usually I try to start off a quote with something that's going to resonate with my audiences, a person that's really part of those audiences. And I totally broke that rule here with a quote from Charlie Munger, who's a investment banker, so a completely different world, but he said it really well. He said that the first rule is that you've got to have multiple models, because if you just have one or two that you're using, the nature of human psychology is such that you'll torture reality so that it fits your models. And the models have to come from different disciplines, because all the wisdom of the world is not to be found in one little academic department. So what I wanted to get across here is that what I'm going to be talking about is not a silver bullet. It's really more of a lens for looking at the world. It's a way of taking a problem or something that you're working on and turning it sideways and looking at it from a different perspective. And that's what systems thinking helps you do. So I don't want to say it's all systems thinking or we should all adopt this framework, but it's often useful, especially when we're talking about adaptation, because there are things called adaptive systems. It's just a new way of looking at things. It's also something systems tend to incorporate network and network processes a lot, and so I think it's a natural fit. So a system is nothing more than a dynamic set of things that are interconnected to produce a pattern over time. So it has to have those four things to really be a system. And so you can think just about anything that's dynamic that we work with could be a system. Our professional lives, the networks that we work on can be looked at as a system, or your circulatory system could be looked at as a system. So there's a wide variety of things, but they all, when you really boil it down to this simple model, you start to see some similarities among different systems. So to give you an example of a very simple system to start off with, I'm going to use a cup of hot coffee. The way that systems are often diagrammed is looking at a stock, a thing that is changing. In this sense, in this example, it would be the temperature of the coffee in the cup. And then a rate of change or a process. And in this case, it would be cooling. And so that's the thing that is happening that's sort of taking temperature off the cup, heat off the cup, and it's dissipating into the environment. So your coffee cup is, if you have a hot cup of coffee, it's going to start cooling down, and it's going to cool down sort of with this loop that's going back between the temperature of the coffee and the rate of the cooling is dependent on the difference between the temperature in the room and the temperature of the cup of coffee. And so that rate of cooling is going to slow down as the cup of coffee gets closer to room temperature. And so room temperature is informing sort of that discrepancy. And you can use this as sort of a mental model of just, okay, this is how a cooling cup of coffee works. Or you can use it as a very quantitative model. You could have, very specific physical representations of a cooling rate in calories per second or whatever, and coffee temperature and how much is in the coffee and what kind of liquid is it, all of those sorts of things. So it could be very quantitative. I'm going to be just talking about sort of qualitative models and mental models today. But know that you can go very much into depth with very detailed models. And there's also software out there that allows you to draw little boxes and circles and arrows, and then it does all the calculus for all the rate changes and partial differential equations in the background. So you don't have to know any math, and you can still do this cool modeling. So another example, a little more complicated example, would be you. and how atoms move in and out of you. So you've got this rate of change of atoms coming into you. And this could be what you're eating, what you're drinking, could be what you're inhaling. Those are all ways that atoms are coming into you. And there's this feedback loop that as you're, say, inhaling, your brain is sort of keeping track of, how long you're inhaling. You're not doing it consciously, but your head's keeping track of how long you're inhaling, how much oxygen you have in your body. And then it's triggering you to eat or inhale or somehow take atoms in to keep you going. And if you think about it, especially when you're a kid and you're growing, this is a feedback loop that results in a bigger and bigger you. You're always taking in, your brain's trying to keep this constant rate coming in greater than what's going out, so you become larger. But what's fascinating to me is that even after we're adults, there's still a lot of flux in the atoms in our body. And about 97% of our atoms turn over every 2 years. So when you think of yourself, you think of yourself as something that stays the same through time, but you're really a system that's in flux, and you're a pattern that persists through time. Part of that is also the atoms out. And the atoms out actually go through another set of a nervous system that's only weakly connected to your head brain. And we're just discovering this in science, called I'm calling it gut brain. It's got a lot of fancy terms, your autonomous system or whatever. But there's that aspect. And so there's another feedback loop that's sort of taking atoms out of your body. And when you have this feedback that's positive, that's bringing things in, and another feedback that's negative and sort of balancing out and saying, okay, we need to change, lower the rate as things change. When you have these two feedback loops together, you get a balanced system, which is why we don't grow up to the size of skyscrapers or shrink down to the size of mice. And then if you want, so that's a very, very simple system. We could add the stomach, and we could add all sorts of chemical processes. We can make this really complicated. We could add your microbiome to this, which is a set of bacteria in your gut that are talking to your brain without you knowing it. And it's looking like they have some say in what you eat. So there's all these interesting cycles. And how these cycles work and how they reinforce each other can have non-intuitive repercussions. For example, if you take in a lot of sugar, for example, you will end up with a lot of gut bacteria in your gut that like sugar. And if you get enough of them, they then start telling your brain, hey, give us more sugar. And you can get a reinforcing feedback here that keeps you eating more sugar than might be healthy for the rest of your body. But it also works in the opposite way. If you're eating a lot of fiber, you can start having a craving for fiber or for caffeine or something like that. But so these are how these systems and how you link the feedbacks together can create how the system works. And so there are certain system traps that can develop, and I'm sort of skipping forward here, but there are a couple of them that I think are relevant to networks and to climate adaptation. One is policy resistance. Who here has experienced policy resistance in the realm of climate change? I think we all have. So every policy involves winners and losers. And so there's a feedback system there. When the losers lose, they don't just give up and lose. They then put more effort in to win next time. And so those losers then do resistance and become winners. And then the winners are losers. And so they work harder. And when you get to these two feedback loops that grow over time but stay in balance. So you can get this policy resistance where the policy stays in place. You can't change the policy, but people are putting more and more effort into maintaining that policy. So instead of talking about flows of atoms, we're really talking about flows of energy. It could be in terms of meetings, membership, funding, number of grants, all of these sorts of things can create this policy resistance. So yeah, those losers resist, become winners. And so you get this ever increasing energy, but the policy never changes. And really all adaptation is change. So if we have adaptation that's not happening, a lot of times this is the system trap that we're getting stuck in. There are stakeholders that are losing that eventually become winners, and the winners become losers. Another system trap is called slide to low performance. And this is a different way that feedbacks start to mesh together. And this happens when goals are set to ensure success. And so we've probably all been in a situation, let's say you're fishing for those really large fish out in the Gulf, and folks are happy if they get, you know, a 200-pound fish. Over time, those fish disappear and people start changing their goals, and they don't expect a 200-pound fish because everybody's getting 100-pound fish, and you become happy with a 100-pound fish. And over time, it's a 50-pound fish. And there's some really great examples of looking at sport catch, you know, over decades and seeing that, you know, people are really happy when they've got this fish that's bigger than they are. And then, you know, 50 years later, they're holding up a fish that's 2 feet long going, this is great. I got the largest one, you know, in a month. And, you know, it's a slide to lower success. But we do that within organizations all the time, especially when people want to set metrics so that they're not going to get embarrassed. You know, they want to make sure they're going to reach those goals. They just set the goals a little bit lower. And each time, you know, if there's something that happens where they miss a goal, they just set the goal lower. So you get shifting baselines and expectations of, say, frequency or severity of flood damage. So this would be working in the other direction. You get more and larger floods, people start to get accustomed to that, and that just becomes the norm. You get organizations and small businesses that build around rebuilding after floods, and then the system starts to perpetuate itself. Dangerous heat would be another one. After a couple heat waves, a city is going to put in place policies that make it so that future heat waves aren't going to be as deadly. And so the city's adapting and shifting the baseline to what is a dangerous heat wave as it progresses. But if the city is changing, the people might not be seeing heat as dangerous, but maybe wildlife is not changing, or some other community is not changing. So is adaptation a slide to lower standards of tolerable climate change? That's a sort of a question you can start asking when you look at things from a climate or a system traps or systems perspective. And the last one is shifting the burden to the intervener. It's often easier to reduce the symptoms rather than the root causes of a problem. And if you continually do that, you'll have fewer symptoms, which reduces the incentive to address the root causes. But that can allow the root causes, the root problem, to get worse and worse. And eventually it becomes something where you can't adapt to the problem because the root problem has gotten so bad. So this is one reason why we always have to try to balance and look for win-win situations where we can do adaptation and, you know, climate mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases. Because if, you know, cowardly politicians just focus on adaptation without doing anything about the underlying cause of the problem, we're not really in a sustainable position. But we can get trapped into thinking that the problem isn't too bad until it's too late. This is also the same system trap that leads to addiction, by the way. So there are also leverage points in systems. And one thing that you find with a persistent problem is that leaders will intuitively recognize where that leverage point is and intuitively pull the lever in the wrong direction because they're not looking at the system and the dynamics and the way their feedbacks are reinforcing. They're just looking at what makes sense in their immediate future and the immediate situation they're in. And that's how persistent problems in systems persist, is that we pull the lever in the wrong direction every time. And so that doesn't mean that you should always pull the lever in the non-intuitive direction, because you can really screw things up that way. But it's good to think about systems and think about how are different actors in the system or different processes in the system either reinforcing or not reinforcing each other, balancing each other. So these traps can also become opportunities if you know sort of some of the leverage points. So for policy resistance, if you bring opposing sides together and draw sort of a larger system where, you know, each side was doing what was rational in their local problem, if you bring them together and have them both try to solve the larger problem, that can often get you out of that policy resistance problem. It's not a panacea because it requires courage, Another one for slide to low performance is trying to keep goals absolute, even if it means that you're going to fail repeatedly for a while. Or you can actually turn this system trap into something that works in the opposite direction. If you always calibrate to your past successes rather than calibrating to your failures, you can actually get a reinforcing feedback that increases your performance over time. And shifting the burden to the intervener, this one, the book said, just avoid getting in this trap. There's really no easy way out. If you get to the point where you've been addressing the symptoms without the root cause for a long time, it can be really, really hard to get out of this. There's no easy way on that. And they said, maintaining a focus on the fundamental problems in whatever situation you're in is the best way to avoid getting into this one. So I'm going to skip over the complex adaptive systems part because it's complicated and just shift to some sort of lessons learned about networks. In networks, tighter feedbacks are not always better, and less lag time is not always better. But in general, when you're looking at adaptation, if you can look at the feedbacks and have them have less time between cause and consequence, that helps people to adapt. That's part of the reason climate change is so hard to adapt, is we've got this 50 to 100-year time lag between what we do to the climate right now and when we feel the consequences. And you need to make the feedbacks tighter so that you have the same people who are causing the problem facing the consequences. If you get that, if that ends up being very loose where the people who are causing the problem aren't facing the consequences, you can end up in these system traps and see less adaptation. So basically, most of what I was pulling this from was that Thinking in Systems book by Janella Meadows. Some other books that I enjoy that sort of bring the systems thinking into a specific context is Managing Forest as Complex Adaptive Systems. And then looking at complex systems, which I sort of brushed over really quickly. But Complexity, A Guided Tour by Melanie Mitchell is a good introductory text for that one.
But thank you again for presenting today, and thanks everyone for joining in. We'll send out notes and we'll have the recording posted to that Google Drive. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.